1 minute later. 2 minutes later. 3 minutes later. 4 minutes later. 5 minutes later. 10 minutes later. 15 minutes later. 20 minutes later. 30 minutes later. 45 minutes later. Several minutes later. A bunch of minutes later. Many minutes later. 1 hour later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later. 4 hours later. 5 hours later. 12 hours later. Several hours later. A bunch of hours later. Many hours later. 1 day later. 2 days later. 3 days later. 4 days later. 5 days later. Several days later. A bunch of days later. Many days later. 1 week later. 2 weeks later. 3 weeks later. Several weeks later. A bunch of weeks later. Many weeks later. 1 month later. Several months later. A bunch of months later. Many months later. 1 year later. Several years later. A bunch of years later. Many years later. 1 decade later. An eternity later.